Welcome to episode 1 of the video series Tips and Tricks for Writing Fics, that is fan fiction. Yes, I've done a series, Tips and Tricks for Manuscripts, but I felt like I needed to give fan fiction special attention because while they are extremely similar, there are particularities to fan fiction that makes it unique, but equally valid as an art form, as a form of literature. So I wanted to do a series on the best ways to have to consider creating a successful fanfic that is successful in that you bring readers to you and you keep them coming back. So here in episode 1, much like in episode 1 of the other series, I'm going to be covering the basics, and it's going to be harkening back to that series a lot because the methods and the modus operandi for both of them can be very similar. But with fanfictions, it is a little different because a lot of the groundwork is already laid out for you. The hard part is deciding what to do with the information you have and what more can you do with the information you're given by the canon properties. So let's go ahead and get started with the first point, is to get familiar with the property, get familiar with the canon, get to an almost not next door neighbor, but more like familial. Treat it like your family. You're going to want to know as much about it as possible and get comfortable with it to where you can immediately recall the information you need and be able to add it to your story in a way that's believable and fluid. You shouldn't be able to. You shouldn't have to force elements of canon into a fan fiction. So a lot of it does depend on your discretion. But the great thing about fan fiction is a great way to cut your teeth as an author, for you to test and try out devices and to really hone your own style, because there's a lot less scrutiny. There's a lot more room for failure, so to speak. There's much larger margin for error, and you get a more instant feedback on where you're going and how you're doing. So it lets you really gauge, to inspect yourself as a writer. And it's like, okay, where am I weak? Where am I strong? Where am I overbearing this? So getting familiar with your canon, but also having the comfort in knowing this is almost like a practice run, I guess you could say. Fan fiction is great practice for writers, especially when they're first starting out. So take all the time in the world you want to get familiar with your chosen properties and just have fun with it, especially if you're just starting out. It's important to have fun with what you're doing because that's going to help you find the comfort you need to get serious about it later. Take time to brainstorm. Like I said, a lot of the topics I'm touching up in this episode is going to harken back to its companion for the manuscript series, and one is definitely one detail you cannot overlook is brainstorming. Put the music on, turn the lights off, and just think about what you want to do with these characters and these worlds that have already been created for you, but are, as a fanfiction writer, that are kind of calling out for your personal touch. So craft a soundtrack to kind of fit the theme of what you want to work with, and that's really going to help you breed ideas and breed plot points, and do so effectively and rather quickly. I'm not saying you should rush the process, but the sooner you can get concrete ideas, the sooner you can build a better story. So just brainstorm. Find the time daily. Make it a habit to take half hour to an hour a day just to brainstorm and take notes and do the research for your fan fiction. It's going to show in the finished product. Trust me, it shows when you know what you're talking about and you have confidence in the story that you're putting out there using these established characters and worlds. It's really going to make a difference, and your fans are going to notice. Even if they don't mention it, they're going to make note of it. So, and it's going to make them want to come back. And that, as a fan fiction writer, is really what you want. You want return audiences. Another method that helps out with the writing process, especially in fan fiction, is my A to Z method, is coming up with a concrete beginning up to the point where if you have original characters, you've introduced them to a degree. If nothing else, just have them make a cameo and have deciphered how they fit into the story. Or if you're not using original characters and you're sticking strictly to canon, that you have all your characters have appeared at least once, and you have the plot set up, have the most basic form of the plot available to the reader, or at least basic tasks that your characters are going to be undertaking. And then you have a concrete ending. What is the story going to achieve? What are the hurdles that the characters will have crossed by the time they reach this point? What is the ultimate fate of these characters and of this canon? So sometimes it's helpful for me to have a concrete beginning and a concrete end, and that leaves the middle open for me to just kind of play with and weed out as I go, what works and what doesn't. Because fan fiction, while limiting in property, is very liberating in creativity. You can do almost anything with established canons and characters, as long as you remain consistent and you're subtle in introducing new ideas and you do your homework. Most of the time it's going to be received really well, and it'll make the writing process really simple for you to have a beginning and an end set up and realize that, hey, I have all this room to roam. What can I do with it? So keep that in mind, the A to Z method. It can be helpful for those of you that can think in those kind of restrictions. For others, it may be different. So just you'll come up with your own process, but that's the one I tend to use, and it has yielded me the most consistent and desirable results. So find your own way, but if you don't have one, that's a good way to start. Let's see. Get familiar with the property characters. Your canon characters, if that's what you're working with, if you're not introducing any new figures, your canon characters need to be like family to you. They need to be your best friend, if not your own skin, so that you know exactly what you're working with, and you can do the best you can with what you've got. So as long as you're really aware of these characters, their personality types, their personality quirks, their flaws, their strengths, what galvanizes them and what breaks them down to a T, you're going to be able to craft some really great dialogue and character interaction that it fits with whatever plot elements and events that you bring about for these characters. Again, like with manuscripts and fan fiction, you are basically God. You can make it happen however you want. But as long as, unless your characters, especially if they're canon characters, unless they're succinct to how they are in the original property, unless they are pretty much what they are in canon, you're going to have a really hard time convincing your readers of what you're doing. You're going to have a hard time keeping them immersed and making them want to come back and read some more. So I can't stress enough how important it is to get familiar with the characters in canon so that you can tell a good story, so that your reader won't put it down and they'll be back when you post the next chapter. Let's see. A few basic tips when you're writing your fan fiction, especially if you're just working with the canon characters, is dialogue and language in regards to them. Don't use overly explicit language. That's one thing I've noticed from a lot of new writers starting out. They tend to use swear words in excess, and it really makes it difficult to read, because you realize almost right away that it's needless. And it's abrasive to the reader to just read a string of swearing that has absolutely no place where it is. I managed to read a paragraph of fan fiction a few years back, and there were so many swear words I had to put it down. I just couldn't. It just robbed me of all interest in wanting to see what was happening next. It was really disheartening, and I can kind of understand where they're coming from, because when I was first starting out, I wanted to swear a lot, because it was just that freedom. It is that thrill of doing something taboo at a young age, because swearing was the big no-no when you're a young person. And when you write, it's so personal, nobody's going to read this. No one I know is going to see this, so I'm going to do what I want, and I won't have to worry about repercussions. So you tend to use swear words a lot, which, I mean, writing is expression, and you shouldn't restrict your expression for anyone's sake but your own. However, there is such thing as overdoing it, and swear word seems to be the public enemy #1 for that offense. So take care with your language use. Swearing has its place, as does every word in any language. They all have their place, but just have some mercy with it. Don't overdo it. Don't swear just because you can. Swear as an emphasis. Use it as an emphatic device. Especially if you swear colorfully. There are some incredible words that I have seen and made as far as swearing goes that it may not seem so awful, but if you really think about it, that's pretty sick. So just use some discretion with your swearing in particular, and I think that'll help you be better received. Another thing that I see a lot of that I, for one, hate in media in general, especially dubbed anime in particular, and in some poorly written games or somewhat shoddy fanfiction. I hate calling it that, but sometimes you have to call it like you see it, and I've seen some pretty bad work before. Overuse of names, character names, especially in television. Because with TV and movies, you see who people are talking to. You can see who's interacting, and there's hardly any use for names when you're speaking to one another. But especially in dubbed anime, they do it constantly. It seems like every other sentence they're using the person they're talking to's name, and it's not necessary. It's a waste of words, and it can be really tiring for the viewer or the reader. And the same thing applies to fan fiction in that. With fan fiction, with literature in general, you don't have that visual, but if it's just two people, just two or three people, it really isn't necessary for them to say each other's names so many times, because with literature, you can use follow-up phrases to dialogue, such as he said, she said, so on and so forth, and you can use their name there to help change up the voice in your reader's head. So it's not necessary for characters to refer to each other by name so often. For me, it's one of my pet peeves. It really turns me off when I read about characters using each other's names so much. It tends to bore me as a reader. So that's one thing I'd like to warn my audience against is using names too much. It has their place to a degree, but you'll develop your gut instincts about writing as you go, but just take care of how often you use characters' names in dialogue. And even in descriptive paragraphs, although I can see the difficulty in it when you're working on characters of the same gender. So, because having written a couple of fanfics recently where I'm spending most of my time on a female couple, it's kind of hard to distinguish who's who without using their name. So instead, what you could do is focus on features, on physical traits of eye color, skin tone, hair color, hair length, things like that help convey to the reader who you're focusing on at the time without overusing their name. Let's see. Because in fan fiction, everybody knows who they're dealing with already. So so just don't over iterate who's talking to who, especially if there's only maybe 2 or 3 of them. So I've written out these episodes, so I'm just kind of checking my notes here. So, yeah, that basically covers this episode. The basics aren't all that different from manuscript basics, but there are some. And you can, of course, you can always check back to those videos for more in-depth tips on writing in general, not just fanfics or manuscripts, but can apply to any type of writing in this instance. So get familiar with your properties and your characters. We'll do a quick recap. Get familiar with what you're working with. If the canon has a particular lengthy history behind it, if there is documentation in the canon about where the cultures and peoples came from, use it to your advantage in your storytelling if you can. Don't force it. Forcing it is going to hurt you in the end. It's going to show, and your readers are going to notice. So take care with that. Use what you can of canon to flesh out your story, but don't force it. Take time to brainstorm. Make a habit of taking a few minutes to an hour or so every day to just kind of listen to music and breed ideas and see what you can come up with and how you can use them. A to Z method. Concrete beginning, concrete end. and then you work out the middle as you go, which tends to be the fun part for me personally, because it really lets me see what my creative gears are capable of without me consciously trying to make them work. So as you grow as a writer, that's really going to be helpful to you, because it quickens the writing process when you don't have to think about what you're doing. If you just let your fingers do the work and your brain control that, you're going to see that you come up with some really amazing stuff as you mature as a writer. Fan fiction is a great way to cut your teeth as an author, because there's not the kind of pressure you have with a manuscript. You get more instant results, more instant ways to gauge your progress and your style through reviews from your readers. So it's a much more fun way to train yourself to be an author, because there's a lot less pressure of criticism. And while fan fiction can be limiting, it can also be liberating in what it lets you do with plot, since you don't have to spend so much time weaving new characters and new worlds and cultures and stuff like that. So all you really need to focus on is the plot and the main points of it. So it's a really great way to get you started writing and to train your muscles to really hit that high where you're doing your own stuff. Get familiar with your property characters. They are going to sell your work. It's that simple. The people read fan fiction because they care about the characters. They want to see what happens to them in different situations than what canon gave them. So you have to be second nature with these characters. Get so familiar with them. It's almost like you know them better than they do. Dabble in some psychology so you can kind of gauge their personality types, and that's really going to help you build unique, powerful, and believable behavioral patterns for these canon characters. So just keep that in consideration. And while fan fictions are different, they're equally valid as literature, as an art form. So don't let your doubts of what you're doing not really being important, or nobody reads fan fiction, because that's a lie. Everybody reads fan fictions, whether they admit it or not. Yes, there are some who don't. However, if chances are, if somebody tells you they don't, they do, and they don't want to admit it. Fan fiction counts. So don't let that get you down that no one's going to read your stuff. In the beginning, they might not. They didn't read my stuff in the beginning, and that's okay. What matters is you don't quit just because you're not the next big thing. So just write because it's what you want. Write because it's what you love and it's what you do. And fan fiction counts. It counts in the long run. Trust me. Let's see. And don't use excessively explicit language. That's going to be a real turnoff for your readers if all they see is a bunch of swear words strung together. And they're going to notice it's just for its own sake. So use it sparingly and use it as an emphatic device to kind of drive home some character traits, especially in an argument. Swearing is going to be a big deal. And avoid using a character's name too much in dialogue. In fan fiction, everybody knows who is who, so don't rely so much on characters speaking to each other to convey who you're focusing on. Use use follow-up phrases to your dialogue sentences, and in descriptive paragraphs, use particular traits to convey to your reader who you're talking about. Facial features, eye color, skin tone, hair color. That's really going to help and not overload your reader with boring words. So keep that in mind, and you are on the road to writing fan fiction like a pro. Not to say that I'm a pro, but you see what I mean. Thank you for tuning in. You can always check out my other videos on manuscripts on my page, of course. Tips and tricks for manuscripts. And hopefully I will see you in Tips and Tricks for Fics in episode 2, Building the Story. So we're going to take what we learned in this episode and kind of branch out on that and get into the finer points of building your plot and how you handle canon characters. So hopefully that'll help you out, and hopefully this gave you some helpful advice as well. And I'll catch you on the flip side.